Thank you for coming to my session today. My name is Sarnek, and I lead the Strategic Partnerships and Alliances team at SaaS Security. For those of you who are not familiar, we are a SaaS security company, so we do everything from identifying localized identities that get created within a SaaS applications, help manage the SaaS application posture, integration, data sharing, all the things like that. So we fit very well in with identities, CASBs, your third-party or vendor risk management program. Having come from third-party risk, I like to think of it as we help manage the vendors in action in your ecosystem that you may not see from the external scans or governance and risk management. So usually I like to talk about cybersecurity and how it fits in with ESG, why it's the most financial sustainability risk topic that exists for us today. But today I'm going to try to talk about something more technical of as SaaS adoptions grew, how we focused on the business productivity convenience. We moved forward in procuring a lot of SaaS applications, but why now we're lagging behind in SaaS security. So I want to start highlighting what we mean by SaaS. We think of SaaS a lot when we think about procurement deployment models for a number of security solutions or really all of the tools. And I think there are several logos that come up here that will be obvious. When we think about email or collaboration suite, O365 and Google Workspace, those become some obvious candidates. And then we think about collaboration suites like Slack, Teams, or Zoom nowadays. And those might obviously come to mind as core SaaS applications, same thing with Salesforce or other internal business tools. The areas that get left behind a little bit, even though we talk about it to the vendors when we procure the solutions, is things like identity and access management solutions. Those are not just important to think about from a deployment model of on-prem versus SaaS model, but it's also important to think about what type of information is stored in there. And same thing goes for tools like Wiz, CrowdStrike, SentinelOne, Orca, Netskope, any of the security SaaS applications, because when we think about API integrations or SaaS misconfigurations, it's not just important to think about our business tools that we're using day to day, but also the security SaaS tools and the configurations in them and what they're connected to. Because if someone cracks into one of those security tools, then it's essentially pretty quickly game over for an organization. So a little bit about why we care about SaaS. I think some of this probably will be obvious to you. Just 2 decades ago, a lot of our data, a lot of our core assets, business IP, those things were stored on-prem. Same thing with business applications or critical internal applications. We talk a lot about transition to cloud, but as we transition to cloud, one of the things that got a little bit forgotten about is the fact that, yes, we moved a lot of things to infrastructure as a service, but what about the SaaS applications? A lot of our critical data and things that organizations make money with today or would lose money if they got breached, any regulatory ramifications, a lot of those assets end up being stored in SaaS application. Even when we think about infrastructure as a service, it has a web front end, it has APIs. So if you're going into those AWS management consoles, et cetera, that's still SaaS. And we quickly realize that essentially everything that we interact with today, if it has a web front end, becomes a SaaS application, which suddenly makes you realize just how big of a problem this can grow to be. And there we go. So the pros and cons of SaaS. The pros, I think, are pretty easy to grasp. There is a very quick time to value. They're nimble. If there's a new update, patch, version, feature, they're automatically deployed, especially during the pandemic when we really hyper-accelerated to having a remote global workforce. SaaS applications kind of became key in deploying a business quickly. And also for those entrepreneurs in the room, SaaS applications are a really easy way to start off a business. You procure a couple of key solutions, you can stitch together new applications and new products, and you suddenly have a business operating that you can start making money with. But then what are the challenges? The biggest challenge that we're seeing today is the fact that the auth tokens that are created between applications, they become so prevalent, and they also are at the highest risk. If you just take one authorization token from a third-party application that's interconnected to you, you could have full access into your core application depending on the level of permissions that this has. Coming originally from the identity space, I worry about the identity lifecycle of SaaS applications. There's a common misconception that if you terminate a user within your identity provider, that you will have a full termination of their access. But what about login with Google, login with Microsoft? Those things aren't captured by the identity provider. So you end up having a lot of dormant accounts within your SaaS applications. And then I talked about it a little bit, but the vendor security. A lot of these SaaS application vendors like to go to market with a message of, well, we build in security to our applications. That may be true, and you may be doing a good job vetting the vendors through your security questionnaires. But do you have visibility into how they're actually deployed, what they're touching, the level of permissions that they have to your core assets? And we like to highlight all of the attacks that have been taking place. I think one thing that's missing from this chart that's being talked about a lot right now is the most recent Microsoft attack that also spilled over a little bit to Azure Access. And to highlight the auth challenge, we have the GitHub attack listed here, where it's not GitHub that was directly breached, right? And with SaaS to SaaS breaches, it becomes really easy to finger point to the third party and say, hey, it's not my problem because I wasn't directly breached. It was one of the vendors. But what happened here in the GitHub attack is it was Heroku and Travis CI that got breached. But Heroku and Travis CI had permissions into an organization's GitHub to fully manage the GitHub accounts that are in there. So just by breaking into Heroku, a third party to the organization, they were then taking their legitimate authorization tokens, signing on to the GitHub accounts, and having direct access to the customer's data. And this is a pretty prevalent pattern that we keep seeing over and over again, along with some different attacks like I recently wrote about the Okta attack, preparing for a partnership where it was a workstation compromise. So an endpoint issue that then, again, you steal the right credentials, you sign on to the core applications. The challenge there is that the pattern of misconfigurations that were then created by the attackers were not visible based on the security solutions that the organization had deployed. So to give a little bit of a scale of this decentralization problem, we talked about how much SaaS applications are growing. I almost think of it as cloud 2.0 when it comes to a security issue. And then we start thinking about the number of integrations that they have. So I have the median of an enterprise applications listed here. Few hundred may or may not seem like a large number, but then when we think about some of the most prevalent applications that we're all used to hearing, like a ServiceNow, Salesforce, etc., those integrations reach a number of thousands. So as a security practitioner, when you think about auditing application to application connections, the level of privilege that they have, that alone probably becomes a full-time job for the entire security team if you were to look to audit it on a regular basis. And the biggest issue of why SaaS is growing as a problem is who's procuring it. When it was an on-prem world, there was still that centralized procurement where you needed to procure everything through IT. But now that business units have their own budgets, those business unit leaders, the individual practitioners, they're going to have their own preference of how they like to streamline their day-to-day operations and increase productivity. So now that they have their own budgets, they themselves are going to look into procure these tools, which you may or may not then catch it through the security office. One CISO that I was speaking to recently, he mentioned that, well, in our procurement checklist, we added CISO approval tick box to make sure that it gets caught by my team. But then he said, and that's great, and we do a security assessment, but then I don't really know what it connects into. And even at the company of 500 employees, I lose control understanding which application is integrating with our Salesforce and stealing our customer data, or which one of the employees are creating shared documents, externally sharing documents that may be sensitive to our organization. So I highlighted this a little bit. There's usually, this misconception of well, I have a CASB, I have a zero trust network architecture, I have endpoint security, so I should be okay. The challenge here is if we think about integrations, if we think about localized account, or for anyone that uses something like a Zapier or WorkAuto, none of these user to application solutions are going to see what else is that application talking to. So this still is a little bit of a legacy approach of everything is going through IT. A user is onboarded, they're given an email account, they're within the SSO suite, and you're kind of living under the assumption that, hey, just because I have an authorized Calendly within my organization, that sales rep is not going to suddenly integrate it. But by the way, Calendly is something that requires a full read and write access to calendar. So you just take a couple of examples like that and then escalate it to your more critical applications, something that will have a more intrusive workflow like Zapier, and you have a pretty large problem at hand. So SaaS built-in security, I like to relate this example to a car. I myself am still a manual 6-shift driver because I find that it gives me more control over my car. And I like to relate this to putting in tablets into our control console. Beforehand, when you were driving, you got to program your favorite radio stations on a number 1 to 6. You could turn the AC dials, and you didn't have to take your eyes off the road, and you were just dialing that. Now, with an attempt to increase user experience and productivity, these sleek tablets, they really require you to shift your eyes off the road and focus on away from the center console to make sure that you can even turn down the heat or turn off your seat warmers. So this is a similar concept where when companies say, we are building SaaS with security in mind, that may be true, but security is just one of the many features. Because when you think about a SaaS vendor and the competitive landscape out there, for every single one of the vendors, including us, our goal is going to be to centralize the user within our platform. We want to make sure that a user has to walk away from the platform as little as possible. And that's where you're going to create integrations to make sure that you manage all of the workflow. You're going to create integrations to centralized data, et cetera, right? So it really requires the security teams to go into each applications, vet the security permissions to make sure that they're properly implemented. I think the one that's coming up recently is around Zoom. So Zoom, for example, has a default option of external users accessing your meeting recordings if you have a URL. And if you don't know to go in and configure that to be private, then it just takes one of your executive teams, couple of layers down, maybe even, to accidentally forward that URL, copy paste on iMessage to someone external. And maybe now you suddenly have a board meeting that's publicly exposed that you didn't want to have exposed. So that's just a little bit of the issues. I'm going to go into more detail around what we're seeing when it comes to external data sharing, the tokens that are being stolen, and things like that. So let's talk about what might be happening within your organization. The great SaaS garbage patch. This is probably one that we can relate to a lot. When we test the product, we deploy it, we interconnect it to our organization. Some products, in order to test, you do need to connect it to your production environments or your actual real accounts, right? Especially when it comes to business users, they're going to connect it to their Gmail accounts, to their Calendlys. Now, when we decide not to procure that solution, we might spin down that solution, but are we spinning down the integrations? What we're seeing is that there are over 50% within the integration landscape, over 50% of those integrations within the environments that we go into are going to be unused integrations. And this, there's a little bit of a shadow IT problem here maybe, but even more so, it becomes a security risk, right? Because if you moved over into, I don't know, from a ServiceNow to a LogicGate or something like that, and ServiceNow still has full authorization access into your account, it just takes for ServiceNow's authorization token to be stolen for them to now go into your environment. So the recommendation here is to remove the unused SaaS integrations and revoke idle shares, but that initial audit may be a pretty big lift. It's an important lift though. So everything, everywhere, all at once. This is moving away from an integration that a single user might create and have a point-to-point access to a single instance or a single account to a holistic view on the enterprise. we see that every single organization that we go into has at least one third-party application that has full tenant-wide access to an organization's core application. And so what this means is that it just takes that one tenant-wide access breach, authorization token to be stolen, credential stuffing for one of the service accounts, something like that, for an attacker to have a full access to your enterprise employee user base, emails, data that are being managed, etc. So tenant-wide access integration, this is something that is needed. The recommendation that we make here, though, is regularly audit to see which tenant-wide access integrations that you have. Make sure that that is the level of privilege that is required. And try to minimize the number of tenant-wide access integrations that you have within your SaaS ecosystem. Convenience debt. So convenience debt, the security debt, is the one that gets created when we focus on productivity rather than focusing on what level of permissions that we create. And I myself have experienced this where when we say that 30% of the time files are shared to personal account, my personal experience is Gmail is now everywhere. I have several personal Gmail accounts, the jobs that I volunteer for, plus my own organizations in the past 2 or 3 years have all used different Gmail accounts. So when we go to access a document from the phone, that's a very easy way to fat finger access from a personal account or an external account. And even the document owner and the admin, they may not always be looking at what email address the access is being requested from. They might just be looking at the name and you're suddenly sharing all of these documents to your personal accounts. Or I think there's always a guilt of, someone's on a road, they don't have access to their work laptop, maybe it's a functional lead or an executive, and we make one exception of, okay, like just for a second, let's share the budget to a personal email account. And then we forget about those external accesses, similar to integrations. So this one is a little bit more of a, not just security, but organizational culture, have security DNA in your organization, where it's important to collaborate with the end users across the organization to teach them why this is a sensitive issue, to show them the risk that it can create. And then it can be a really good feedback loop, in addition to setting policies like external access termination after 30 days. Sleepy accounts, active risks. I think this is one of the 2 identity topics that we like to talk about. I touched on dormant accounts for a little bit, and we see that 1 in 8 employee accounts are dormant. And this happens for numbers of reasons. One of them is the assumptions that if you terminate someone within an identity tool, that they're going to be terminated across all of the SaaS applications. It also can be that if we think about the Drizzly breach, the Drizzly breach occurred because the executive who was participating in a 1-day hackathon was given a GitHub account that was part of the organization's GitHub account. Now, after the hackathon, that executive's account was not terminated, and it became a dormant account. The executive moved on. A couple of years later, an attacker breached the executive's credential completely external to Drizzly. However, there was a password reuse problem. So all it took was credential stuffing across all of the different executives' platforms, both personal and former employment, and they were able to hack into Drizzly. And now all of the customer data is exposed. So here, the recommendation really is to not assume that all of the identity solutions that you have deployed are also terminating accounts and accesses within the SaaS platforms. It's very easy to create local accounts, especially when the SaaS applications are being procured by external business departments. And those sign in with Google, sign in with Microsoft, those things are not something that is directly captured by your IDPs. Oops. So death by exception. I'm a former economist, so to me the Pareto rule is one of the most interesting one. I think it applies to many things out there in the world. We're seeing that, again, 1% of the accounts lack proper MFA configuration within the SaaS space. And this is, again, one of those things that we assume that if we have SSO or MFA policy deployed within the organization, that it's going to capture all SaaS application. But if you don't have centralized control over which SaaS applications are being procured, deployed, and integrated within the environment, all it takes is just one application within sales, marketing, or whichever environment to have an authorization token connected to your core applications to start an attack. So here it's again an audit drill of make sure that MFA is enabled and enforced for humans and machine-to-machine identities. It really sounds basic. We've been talking about it for a long, long time. It's just highlighting the gap that it exists within the SaaS applications today. So what can you do? I have 6 recommendations for us today. They're kind of bucketed in 2 separate ones, prioritized. Number 1, most important, is to review new integrations and offboard any unused or unnecessary integrations. This can just be simple diligence. If we know that there is a proof of concept that's being run, just follow up and make sure that those integrations are terminated that were created. Same thing with the SaaS accounts. When an employee offboards, it's very easy to have just that secondary lifecycle check of, yes, we offboarded them from company, but then let's take a look at what did that employee have access to and just double check that all of those accounts were also terminated. You know, if there's maybe as part of the audit that you're creating, you reach out to each one of the departments and ask what their core applications are that everyone uses, double check that it's incorporated within your IT repository, and that way, when someone walks away, you'll be able to reach out and make sure that within those local SaaS applications, that account is also gone. And then using a centralized identity provider, I talked a lot about why this alone is not enough, but this is very much still helpful because you're going to have a localized identity repository, and the termination, the lifecycle identity management starts at that centralized identity provider. The second set, so implementing data labels. SaaS products alone will not necessarily have data loss prevention built in them, but a lot of them do have data labeling that you can leverage. So just by creating data labels and then starting to see who's sharing what type of document, it's going to significantly accelerate the audit process, because rather than making assumptions across all of your files, we can filter down to critical files that may be related to budget, IP, or any PII, that we can narrow down and make sure they're not being externally shared where they shouldn't be. Leveraging native SaaS security controls. So while security is just a feature for these vendors, that doesn't mean that security configurations are not built in. A lot of the times the security configurations are built in, but it's more a question of what's set up as a default configuration within that specific application. So just going in and making sure that there is strong diligence across all the different SaaS applications deployed within your organization to take a look and make sure that enterprise MFA is enabled, and so on and so forth. And the last one is studying SaaS breaches. There's going to be a lot of interesting combinations when it comes to sophisticated attacks. Like I said, endpoint to SaaS is my favorite right now, but I'm also working on investigating lateral moves from SaaS to cloud posture and vice versa. So there's a lot of new attacks that are going to continue to emerge. Some of them are going to be more legacy prevalent attacks that are just simply now applying to SaaS applications. So studying the different SaaS attacks can be very interesting. Is SaaS security going to get worse? Our prediction is for the near term, yes. So we're talking a lot about data surfacing and the need for remediation. So being able to create automated remediation, whether it's through policy workflows within your organization, that's certainly going to help the cleanup. Now, the second one, around collaboration with the end users. I think more so than ever, having strong organizational governance down to individual governance to make sure that there is a strong sense of security is going to be important, because if you're able to create that feedback loop of, hey, just a heads up, if you buy something that connects to our email, it could be a risk, that starts making your employees be more and more conscious about what they may be doing. We have one customer that we worked with specific to our organization where we discovered several thousand unique integrations for them, and they reached out to the end users and they said, hey, like, this integration is A, not allowed, B, not used for most of you guys. Can we go ahead and terminate it? You can either use this button to say yes, or you can send us an email justifying why you need it. 25% of the organization just clicked the button. 5% came back and said, we still need this, and provided a justification. And the rest of the 70% was just automatically remediated. So that's a pretty good win, if you ask me, because you now narrow down the number of integrations to users that you have, and you know exactly who those users are. And then finally, AI, right? I think AI accelerates some of the attacks that have been taking place within the organization. You're able to automate a lot more things. You can, even now with the development tools, you can access code. So some of the risks that we're going to see in the SaaS space are going to increase and are going to be more prevalent. So AI, we think, is going to increase the SaaS adoption boom. It's also going to increase the risks within the SaaS space. And that is my overview. I have a good number of time left for questions, if anyone has them. Nope.
I'd like to know exactly what service you provide. I mean, I know very clear your presentation and the risks with SaaS and loose ends, and I look at it like that. But so what does Valence, what will you do?
Yeah, I was told to not specifically give a product pitch, which is why. But so, yes, so Valence Security, we provide SaaS security, both on a posture side, discovery when it comes to application integration. We discover any localized accounts or misconfigurations within an application. As an example, if an enterprise MFA policy is not enabled or public file share is accidentally enabled within an application, things along that line. The interesting part that we provide, though, is we provide automated workflows for automated remediation. So rather than having to just surface information and doing that manual audit, within our platform, we enable a capability for you and to go in and set a policy of any integration that's unused over 90 days, please go in and clean up. And the way that we do that is we provide as much coordination with the end user or as little as you want. So maybe as a security office, your first line of defense, by default, you want to terminate everything and then communicate with the user. So you're able to do that, where you would automatically terminate an unauthorized integration or document share and subsequently use whatever process already exists within your organization, like email, Slack, Atlassian, Jira tickets, or go through our platform to send a message and say, hey, you just created this integration, it's not authorized, we're terminating it, but please explain to us why you need it so that we can go through a proper vetting and approval process. So I think I lost my train of thought, sorry. Yes?
Basically, you provide CNAP, no cloud-native application protection, like CASB, workloads, and protection of customer configuration of SaaS.
So we're a component of CNAP because I think CNAP is becoming a large category where they're trying to have all of the cloud Cs in it. And SaaS Security and SSPM becomes a component of that because SaaS applications live within it. So we're a complement today. I think when it comes to CSPM and SSPM, there's a lot of discussion about the complement. It's more of, I think, a theoretical alignment today, though. There isn't a direct overlap between SSPM and CSPM because CSPM is still going to look at infrastructure as a service very tightly. And then SSPM is going to look at the posture of SaaS applications. So I think for those companies that are forward-looking, there's a lot of analysis concentrated in user and user accounts to see what type of attacks can take place if either one is compromised and move on to a different space. CASBs are also going to be another complement to SSPM. So short answer, yes, kind of. It's a piece of the pie of CNAP that's being talked about. It's not a whole entire CNAP, though.
We're just going to use the mic for the next questions. Sorry.
Okay. Any other thoughts, feelings, emotions? Well, Thank you for attending, and please let me know if you'd like to know more.
Anna Sarnek, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.